So we are almost finished our time together, right? And this is the last of my sort of official lectures. We still have class on Friday, which will be a revision and some sort of examples, things for the exam, for the midterm exam. Again, that's led by you. So if you have specific things you want to talk about, things that you didn't quite catch during class or during the lectures, now's your opportunity to let me know, and we can go back and go over those again. Okay. Some people have already messaged me about the statistics components, and I'll give a bit of, dedicate some time to that. In terms of the balance, this is lecture number 13, so there'll be about 40 questions, so you can sort of expect 2 to 3 questions per lecture. At the moment, we've got lecture notes from Kurt Samwise's seminar, guest seminar, so there'll definitely be questions on that. Emily hasn't been able to get, so she's out in the field at the moment. If I don't get her lecture notes up by today, her stuff won't be on the exam on Monday. Okay, so if you see those lecture notes up and there'll be a note in D2L, then yes, that'll be on the exam. If they're not, then those questions will be supplemented with something else or replaced by something else. Okay, is that clear? Yes? Good. So today we're going to talk about biogeochemical cycles. And you may have guessed, or you may have sort of, hopefully it's worked as we've sort of gone through these lectures, that they sort of come in chunks where there's sort of 3 or 4, 2 or 3 lectures on a similar type of topic that kind of work together. And this is the third, or this final lecture is sort of the third of a 3 talking about energetics and nutrients and how ecosystems are fueled. So we started out looking primarily at energetics and productivity and how energy flows through a food web and ultimately up through an ecosystem. We sort of started with this, looking at some simple and slightly more complex food web models and how these are fueled by primary productivity. So if we want to know where we expect rich food webs or higher trophic level productivity, we have to understand at the base of the food chain, understand the factors that regulate primary productivity. And we discussed this on a series of different scales, ultimately up to global patterns in productivity, which is driven by temperature, resource availability, and moisture, climate and nutrients. As we go up through trophic levels, we see we're looking at the trophic energy efficiency, where we require larger biomass, so we lose energy with each trophic transfer. So we require a large biomass of primary producers to create a much smaller biomass of primary consumers. Remember, that relationship can be inverted if we look at it on a short period of time. This is over a lifetime, say. If we look at that over a short period of time, because primary producers, be it grasses or phytoplankton, have a very short life cycle, so are regularly turning over. So primary consumer can graze on those, increase its biomass relative to what's available at any one point in time. In the last lecture, we then looked at the sort of the second component of this, and moving on climate components to nutrient availability and nutrients fuel production. And we started this looking initially at a terrestrial environment. And we could say, so here in the terrestrial environment, there's a direct linkage between the primary producers, in this case the trees, and the decomposers, and these nutrients are directly continually being cycled through the food web, through the ecosystem. In an aquatic environment, we often don't have that direct link, that same individual that's linking those two components. So we can have a zone of productivity, a zone of decomposition, nutrient poor, nutrient rich, And certainly in lakes, when we talked in a couple of lectures about how we get these periods of lake mixing, which bring nutrient-rich water from deep down up to the surface to stimulate more plant growth, or plankton growth. The same thing occurs in rivers, but in addition to this vertical transfer, we also have a temporal transfer as the water is moving down the channel. So rather than just a loop, we said that in rivers this can be interpreted more so as a spiral, as these nutrients are cycling downstream. As we move out into sea, initially at a coastal environment, we've got overlapping layers of water, lighter fresh water, denser salt water underneath, and that creates a climb where plankton is also filtered and also moves. We've got one productivity zone up high, second productivity zone down low, and brings those nutrients back in towards the river mouth. Why river estuaries are really, really productive zones, because those nutrients are being kept close to the river mouth and continually being cycled around. And then finally, as we move out into the oceans, we talked much earlier about these climatic factors which drive the trade winds, which in turn drive the ocean currents. And those ocean currents and the counter currents below them determine how or when deep water, nutrient-rich deep water, is brought back up at coastal upwelling zones, stimulating more planktonic productivity. Today we're going to delve into this in a little bit more detail, sort of staying on the same theme, but really seeing how we link the two of these processes together. How nutrients cycle through the environment. And we term these as biogeochemical cycles. We're looking at essentially how chemicals are moving, how elements are moving, and how they're available, when and where they're available to biological organisms for growth and production. These reactions, or these cycles, are determined by, again, the same type of traits keep coming up. Atmosphere, water availability, the type of soil or chemical material will determine what type of productivity we see and how these nutrients are cycled. There's two main types, or two main phases, say, within these cycles. We've got a gaseous phase, which is sort of, you could think of it as free moving, where we've got movement within the atmosphere and also within the oceans. So here, nutrients are quite often might be attached to water molecules, are moving through on a global scale, can move through the environment. We also have a sedimentary phase, where nutrients are, in some cases, we see later, in some cases trapped within sediments, are not biologically available, but also may be biologically available within the soils. We're going to look at this, or we can see this as across a series of scales. When we look at a plot like that, we're sort of talking about large landscape level or even global level movements of nutrients. But at a smaller spatial scale, we've also got the same processes occurring, or similar processes occurring. And regardless of what scale we're looking at it, there's certain traits of these biogeochemical cycles which are common across all. The first is that we've got defined inputs and defined outputs. We can think of this block, this forest, as our system. And we've got inputs of nutrients to the system, outputs of nutrients from that system. The system depends where we define it. In this instance, it's being defined as a forest. But if we wanted to include wetlands or lakes within that system, then we'd be looking at different types, where we'd have a different boundary for our inputs and outputs. we start with the terrestrial environment. So we've got atmospheric inputs, moisture, CO2, things like that that are coming up into the plants. We've also got inputs of minerals from weather and rocks within the soil. External inputs moving into our system. And then we've got outputs with nutrients perhaps being leached from the soil, CO2 given off through respiration, nutrients, minerals that are being taken out of the system. We can look at this as a sort of a schematic, as how and sort of trace how nutrients move through a system. In this plot, we've got a series of different sections. We've got organic materials, inorganic materials. We've also got components of a system, components of our ecosystem, where nutrients are available and nutrients are unavailable. And within the organic, we can sort of think of this as our food web here. And that is interacting with inorganic materials. So we've got an inorganic component, but the nutrients here are actually available. We can also have organic components where nutrients are unavailable and inorganic components where nutrients are unavailable. So we start here with primary producers. Primary producers are essentially the base for all of these cycles. They're the only zone or the only component which is fixing atmospheric CO2, bringing CO2 from available inorganic into an available organic. They get their nutrients, their resources from the available inorganic, from the environment. And that could either be, if we're dealing with a grass or a tree, they're getting their CO2, their water, and their nutrients from the soil. If we're dealing with phytoplankton, they could be getting their CO2, water, and nutrients from the water, from the environment around them. These primary producers, their material forms the constituents of higher trophic level consumers. Any consumers are feeding either on the primary producers or something else that's fed on the primary producers. So when the primary producer has fixed some CO2 and the grazer comes along and eats that primary producer, it's integrating that actual carbon. And when a predator comes and eats that grazer, it then in turn also integrates that actual atom of carbon that the primary producer fixed from the atmosphere. Over time, this carbon or these nutrients can end up in a series of different silos or a series of different pools, either as detritus, when the consumer dies or the primary producer dies, potentially even in the body tissue or subsequently in the body tissue of a decomposer or a detritivore, like bacteria or a fungi that starts breaking down some of those primary producers, integrates that carbon. The same carbon is cycling through multiple consumers, multiple trophic levels. Alternatively, it could end up trapped in sediment. It could end up, so this is where we've got biologically synthesized, say, carbon trapped in the tissues of an organic consumer, but that becomes built up in sediment, becomes unavailable as either coal reserves or oil, things like that. And we've got organic material which is trapped within the sediment and is biologically unavailable. In a natural environment, or if we don't have people around, it will remain unavailable for a very long time. But our activities of mining and burning fossil fuels have really strengthened the link between this silo of unavailable nutrients and available inorganic material. As we burn, as we'll see in some subsequent slides, as we burn fossil fuels, those nutrients, and particularly that carbon, becomes available back into the pool of inorganic available nutrients. Here, it can either precipitate out and form sediment, build up in sediments, form sedimentary rocks, and again become unavailable. Or alternatively, it can be synthesized by primary producers and brought directly back up into the available organic nutrients. Was anybody at I know some people were at the seminar last Friday? No? One or two? Yeah? It was excellent. Yeah. There was a really good, so it was all about how food webs and ecosystems, how they have resilience to climate change. What happens to particularly a subarctic or a very cold environment? What happens to the ecosystem there if temperature and CO2 levels increase? And there was a really interesting question that sort of sparked a little bit of debate about, as temperatures are increasing, the tree line is moving further north. So when we talk about the different biomes, as temperatures are increasing, we're getting more growth further north. And the question was, that increased growth is sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere. It's taking additional CO2 from the atmosphere. So how do we model, how do we understand or interpret the impact of that, or how that will relate to the additional availability of CO2? And it's a really nice example, it's a really nice thought experiment to sort of see, take this system, take this model, and as we change one thing, something else is going to change as well. And understanding this very, very complex balance, this very, very complex dynamics. So we're going to talk next a little bit more about the direct ways through which this occurs. So we've seen in theory, or that nutrients can move from one zone, from one of these silos to another. In terms of the actual inputs to an ecosystem, there's two components, so there's two ways that these can be classed. Either as wetfall, which are nutrients which are supplied with precipitation, primarily from the atmosphere, or dryfall, which are nutrients which are brought in on airborne particles and aerosols. Remember here we're dealing with the actual elements, the actual nutrients, rather than a big dump of leaves. In a terrestrial environment, most nutrients will come from the soil, excepting things like CO2 that are taken up from the atmosphere. In an aquatic environment, the majority of these nutrients are coming either from the drainage water, from the detritus. You take here, it's aquatic environment from the Mississippi River. All its nutrients are coming from the whole terrestrial environment across the sort of central plains of North America. That's where it's getting its input. Central plains, you can see this as an output of resources. It's losing resources through to this aquatic environment. Also, when we have a river that will regularly flow, will directly take some of its sediment load, some of the nutrients within that river, and deposit those out onto a terrestrial environment, where they'll form part of the soil, and those nutrients through the soil will then become available to terrestrial primary producers. Nutrient loss can happen in that abiotic form, but also is regulated by a biotic form. We can think of an example of hippopotamus, which feeds during the night on the terrestrial environment, feeds on grasses during the night. During the day, spends its time in rivers and in cool water, digests the grass, excretes a lot of matter, and that nutrients is lost, moves into the river system and moves away downstream. So here we've got a biotic conduit, say, to move terrestrial energy or terrestrial nutrients into an aquatic zone and subsequently out of the system. The alternative, or sort of flip that on its head, and we've talked a little bit about Pacific or even Atlantic salmon. Certainly Kurt Samuels would have talked about this in his seminar. as providing marine-derived nutrients. So they leave freshwater, go to sea, feed on pelagic plankton or krill, which are fueled by oceanic energy, say, or marine primary producers. Take that carbon and nitrogen, bring it back to the rivers on their spawning migrations, and either release their eggs there, or the Pacific salmon will die there. And that's a direct transfer of nutrients back into the terrestrial biome. So we can see that we've got distinct ecosystems. There's constant movement between these two. There's constant input and output between these two, depending on where, and the limits for that depend on where we classify our ecosystem boundary. Humans, as ever, are modifying the environment and have an additional impact on, particularly on the loss of nutrients in an ecosystem. Harvesting in the form of farming or logging permanently removes nutrients from the system. We take an example here of a field. Crop grows, gathers up a lot of the nutrients. The crop is then harvested, but instead of decomposing on the site, instead of that cycle being present, it's then removed, particularly the high nutritious quality component is removed and taken away. So we've lost that natural decomposition cycle. And for that reason, we supplement it with fertilizers and add fertilizers to the soil. Forest fires do have a similar effect. Lost a lot of, burn a lot of the, as fire burns, as forests burn, a lot of the standing biomass is lost, a lot of that energy is lost, and the amount of nutrients that are potentially available are lost. If you've got a very large fire, that can be a net loss to the system. A smaller fire can actually have a net gain to the system because it stimulates new productivity. And that's why we can have things like prescribed burning within a managed agricultural land or managed forestry land to stimulate additional growth. For the remainder of the lecture, we're going to talk about how these nutrients, we'll zoom this back out to sort of that global overview and see how these nutrients move between one ecosystem to another, and look at how different nutrients move. They have unique chemical characteristics which determines their availability, determines the type of bonds they can form, which in turn determines what type of forms they are when they're biologically available. When are they biologically unavailable, and when are they biologically available? We'll look at carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, oxygen, all essential elements to life, but all have a distinct chemical composition, distinct chemical traits, and cycle in different ways. The first to talk about, or the first to think about, is carbon. And it's think of it as linked to energy, or to closely tied to productivity. Yeah. So systems are constantly synthesizing, or primary producers are synthesizing carbon from the environment, from the atmosphere, and losing that carbon through decomposition. There's a net ecosystem productivity, which is the rate at which carbon is synthesized minus the rate at which it's lost. We want to see now what are the patterns, or what determines this rate. What determines the rate at which CO2 is available within a system. And this varies both on temporal scales, across a day, a season, and also on spatial scales, at a short spatial scale, and also very large spatial scales. So this is a really nice and interesting plot from the textbook. And what this is an example of the availability of CO2, the amount of CO2 within the air, within a forest, over the course of a 24-hour period, over the course of a day. Each of these lines are called isoplets, kind of like isophores. Each of them will determine or represent the availability of CO2. So high in the canopy full, or high in the forest canopy, we've got CO2 around about 320 parts per million, 330, stays around about just over 300. As we go lower down within the actual forest, we see we've got the same 320, but a large drop in the middle of the day. A large drop in CO2 availability between 9 and 3 o'clock, say. And what we're seeing here is when the plants are most photosynthetically active, they're absorbing CO2. There's less CO2 available in the environment because it's being absorbed by the plants. If we go right down to the forest floor, we see along here we've got the highest amounts of CO2 available at all. And it's relatively stable throughout the day. So, the more interesting part, so we can see, you can read that off the slide, you don't even need that to be a question. But we've got the highest amount of CO2 available at the forest floor. The interesting question is why? What's happening down at the forest floor that's producing more CO2? Sorry? Yeah, exactly, yeah. Decomposition, that's where the majority of the respiration is occurring. That's where all the microorganisms are, the majority of the animals are, that are decomposing material, that are feeding on material, that are constantly respiring, that are producing CO2. And that remains pretty constant right through the day. So what we're seeing here is a flux, a change as we move from a heterotrophic dominated community to an autotrophic dominated community. And we can see how their resource use is influencing the resource availability, the availability of CO2 within the environment. We also see, or we can see, well, what we should see, seasonal variation in carbon availability for the exact same reasons. We've got more CO2 available during leading up into midsummer, at least in a northern temperate environment. Lower CO2 available as we move into the winter. Higher photosynthesis in the early summer, lower photosynthesis in the winter. We can then measure this. So this is in theory, a lot of these ideas were around for quite a while. But we need to have data to back it up. Okay, this is a little segue because it's a really, really neat story. This up here is David Keeling. Has anybody heard of the Keeling curve? No? So in the late 1950s, he was an environmental scientist with NOAA in the US and developed a methodology. He was working in Scripps out in San Diego. Developed a methodology to measure, do two things. One, to measure CO2 from the air. And essentially went to go out with a glass jar under vacuum, open it in the air, allow it to fill with oxygen or fill with air, bring it back to the lab, measure the amount of CO2 within that sample of air. He started doing this every few hours in the 1950s. Here in Scripps on the west coast, almost in the ocean. And later in the 60s, moved to Mauna Loa Research Station on Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And the beauty of this site is that he's right out in the middle of the ocean, away from any anthropogenic produced carbon, essentially measuring pure atmosphere, measuring a really well-mixed atmospheric signal. And it's built up, starting with him and others have continued to work, has built up one of the best records we have for CO2, the amount of CO2 in the environment, or CO2 in the atmosphere. And we can look at that, how that varies across its period of scale. You'll note this data is all available from Scripps website. I do advise check this out because it's actually really neat. If you're on Twitter, you can even follow, you get a daily update on Twitter as to how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere. So this is from the most up-to-date reading we've got, is day before yesterday. And what we're seeing here is across a week, variation between nighttime, daytime, nighttime, daytime, nighttime, daytime. And what we can pick up here is that flux, that change in CO2 availability. That it peaks, I'm saying that the wrong way around, peaks in the daytime, troughs at nighttime. So this is actual data which fits our hypothetical model of how CO2 should fluctuate in the atmosphere. We can build this out over a longer scale. So this is looking over a 6-month period. Early spring, summer, later spring. We can start to see, as we'd expect, some of these seasonal shifts, seasonal fluctuations in CO2 availability, or the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, based on the amount of primary production within that region, across the Earth. We can look at these over annual cycles. So here we've got, say, a midsummer, midwinter, midsummer, midwinter for the last 2 years. Again, really detailed, world-class data set, which allows us to test these hypotheses that we have. I said he's been doing this since the late 1960s, early or late 1950s. When he started measuring this, it was around about just over 300 parts per million CO2 within the atmosphere. Earlier last year, we passed this critical threshold, or it was double the critical threshold, of 400 parts per million. And we're now rise 405 parts per million and rising every single day. So this is data which we can use to directly trace the amount of CO2 in the environment. We can look at this, compare this data with records from ice cores or from tree cores or from a variety of different types of sources. And what we see is if we use these core data and go back several thousands of years, over the last 10,000 years, relatively stable up until this point, around about 200 years ago, when it just went off the charts. We've had this, remember we talked about this, this hockey stick curve for global temperatures and global CO2 earlier in the course. This is the data. This is a big part of the data for CO2, which builds into those analyses. Comes from Keeling's recordings in Mauna Loa. We can time this, and when we look at what happens here, this is exactly correlates or matches with the time of the Industrial Revolution, when we began industrially exploiting unavailable CO2 that was trapped within oil and coal and gas reserves. One of the really nice things that we can do is, as well as measuring the actual availability of CO2, we can look at the stable isotope ratios of CO2. And that's, I'm not going to have time, unfortunately, of course, to talk too much about it, but you could think of that as a tracer for the different types of carbon. And that will let you know whether this is new carbon, that was formed in the oceans, old carbon that has been from fossil fuels, carbon that's from cars. And if we plot that data with this data, I don't have it there, we can see that this spike in CO2 is all old carbon. It's all CO2 that was fixed within fossil fuel reserves. So what happens to all this CO2? We're pumping a load of new CO2 into the environment. And so we've got these CO2 sources, which are, in this case, when we talk about it in terms of human activity, there are also natural, like natural respiration and things like that, that are CO2 sources. But all that CO2 comes out into the environment and is taken up into CO2 sinks by primary production. Absorbed into plants, thus brought down into decomposers, into the oceans, brought down as particular matter, brought down into the ocean, stored in ocean sediments and ocean depths. Next one to talk a little bit about is nitrogen. Well, remember we talked about nitrogen. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because we talked about nitrogen quite a bit at the start of the last lecture. But again, what we're looking at here is changes in the availability of nitrogen over the last 100 years or so. And around about the early 1940s, around the time of the First World War, we developed methodologies to industrially fix atmospheric nitrogen and produce nitrogen from as fertilizer, which could then be added to the soils. We had a natural cycling of nitrogen. We see natural amounts of nitrogen which are constantly being available, always being turned over through the same sort of production and decomposition cycles, but were naturally available. What we've done is added anthropogenic nitrogen to this. We've added more nitrogen to this cycle, which has increased global productivity. Phosphorus is kind of similar. We haven't talked about it too much, so it's a little bit more time on that right now. Phosphorus, well, it's a little bit different, that it has no atmospheric cycle. So there's no atmospheric phosphorus. We can't fix phosphorus from the atmosphere. So all the phosphorus that's on the planet cycles through from terrestrial environments into marine environments, sediments out, forms new rocks. Those new rocks eventually can be weathered and broken down, and then the phosphorus cycle completely. There are phosphorus reserves. So phosphorus, again, is an essential nutrient for plant growth. Often is even more limiting than nitrogen, or is found or is required in a smaller amount than nitrogen. So it's a really, really active or important fertilizer. But we can't fix it, so we mine it. And a lot of it, the phosphates that are mined, are actually mined from guano reserves, from large animal fecal deposits, which are formed into phosphates and can be mined from the rock, created, turned into fertilizer, placed back on the land. What we're doing is taking phosphorus, which would have been unavailable, and through anthropogenic activities, making that available, adding that to the land, in turn stimulating more plant growth. That's pretty much what we just talked about. In a freshwater environment, the phosphorus is available through both particulate organic matter and dissolved organic matter, so depending what form it is in the environment, or as inorganic phosphates. But all of these are biologically available. All of these can be absorbed by phytoplankton. They are a critical limiting factor. So when you add phosphorus, particularly if you add phosphorus and nitrogen, you stimulate very, very rapid plant growth, massive plant growth, like those algal blooms in the experimental lake experiments that we talked about. Sulfur, don't know if sulfur cycle is less well known, has a similar makeup to the nitrogen cycle, that it does have an atmospherically available component. In the long term, it's tied up in sediments, but again, it can be released through weathering and biological activities. Can release sulfur into the atmosphere. Becomes atmospherically available through precipitation or even gas exchange at the ocean surface by phytoplankton. When it's, in the case where it forms in sediments, it could form large reserves of pyrite or pyritic rocks, which are valuable to humans, which humans can mine, again, to produce sulfur as a fertilizer, as a resource. But in turn, that releases additional sulfur back into the environment, stimulates the cycling of more sulfur. The oxygen cycle. We have two main sources of oxygen, either through the breakup of water vapor or also through photosynthetic production, but also by directly consuming either CO2 or water. Organisms can absorb oxygen or can obtain oxygen through that way. The final point to make on this is that all of these cycles are linked together, and the transfer of, we sort of talked about in terms of the physical mobility of nutrients from one type of environment to another, that there's linkage there between ecosystems and between biomes. But remember what we talked about in the last lecture about limiting resources. And production will always be determined by the least available resource. So in phytoplankton, we can say that if you look at some phytoplankton, either marine or freshwater phytoplankton, look at it at its atomic scale, at the atomic level. For every one atom of phosphorus, there's about 16 atoms of nitrogen and 106 atoms of carbon. So we can have an absolute abundance of CO2 in the environment, a massive abundance of biologically available carbon. But if we're restricted either by the amount of nitrogen or the amount of phosphorus, plankton won't grow. So it limits the ability for, well, it's not limit the ability, but it restricts the rate at which CO2 or any other nutrient can be sequestered back into the environment. There's an abundance of CO2 available, but systems are limited by nitrogen or by phosphorus, as we modify the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles and make those nutrients more readily available, that can stimulate additional plankton growth, stimulate additional plant growth, absorbs more CO2. That CO2 can then be sequestered into sediments. That's around about where we're going to leave that there. I'm going to do a sort of a bit of a recap on Friday, and then we can sort of talk a bit about the exam. But if you do have particular areas you want to talk about, be sure to email me either today or tomorrow so we can fit it in for Friday. All right, enjoy the rest of your week.